Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Pauline Johnson today. That's She's from Six Nations, obviously a notable figure. I think most people probably are aware of her in some capacity. I'll do a quick overview of her life. Yeah, it's kind of weird being on Zoom because it took a long time for all of us to get accustomed to doing Zoom presentations and chats and meetings and stuff, and now we're kind of the other end of things, hopefully. So now it's kind of weird being back in that space. I've lost my comfort and my rhythm of doing a Zoom presentation now that I'm back in the classroom. So I have to readjust. My muscle memory is not what it was. But and I'm driving a new laptop, test driving a new laptop today. So that's why I'm not in control. But Christine um, will work the PowerPoint for me. We won't get into the tech aspects of that. But anyway, all that to say is uh, thanks everybody for coming out on your lunch hour. Zoom has been good because it allows people to be a part of this without having to actually physically be on campus. And that's more and more of a chore every day for those of us who do come on the campus with parking, construction, everything else. But anyway, it's good to see everyone. So Pauline is, like I said, very well known in these parts. She's from Six Nations, born and raised, lived the first third of her life or so, born in 1861 on the banks of the Grand River and Chiefswood Estate, Chiefswood Mansion that her father built in 1856. It was made a National Historic Site in 1953, just because its architecture style. It's an Edwardian architectural style. We'll get to that in a bit in the PowerPoint. But just that she's from a notable family, a notable community, and had a lot of political and social exposure to things happening on the reserve. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, sort of 19th century social and political environments at Six Nations. And I guess the context of the times in which she did her work. And from her position as a Mohawk woman with an English mother, the political things that she navigated, the social things of being a woman, being an Indigenous person, being an Indigenous woman, all very complicated things for her time. And she did a remarkable job. And we often, those of us who discuss Pauline and talk about Pauline and remark about, like, she's a very compelling figure. She's still a mystery to most of us. And that's good because it keeps the conversation alive, right? It keeps her interesting. She's not some sort of relic from the past. The things that she talked about and wrote about and felt passionate about are things that we're still talking about now, 160 years later, since her birth, at Six Nations and elsewhere amongst and within a lot of Indigenous contexts. There's a lot to discuss, a lot that she took up, a lot of things that are still unresolved. So I'll just Christine, if you could please go to the next slide. That was a notable picture of Pauline. The profile. It was always kind of her right side, seemed to be her preferred side for the glamour shots. And there's a lot of those. And here's another publicity photo. I like this one. It shows her other side, very defiant, kind of, I think very tongue-in-cheek, it seems to me, these images. Nowadays, we're so inundated with photos of each other and ourselves on our cell phones. It's such an easy thing to do. But back in her time, of course, 1880s, this probably would have been taken. Photos were a pretty expensive, big endeavor. You couldn't just sort of casually shoot things. Everything was set up in a studio and this and that. So very performative, right? But I like this one. It seems to me her sense of humor a little bit. Strike a noble, no, Mohawk woman pose or something. But what's also, and there's her dates, below 1861 and 1913. But what's also interesting is this dress, her stage attire, let's call it. I often tell my students she was sort of like the Lady Gaga or Madonna or Beyonce of her time. Taylor Swift now, I guess. Very popular, in that time, the 1880s, 1890s was kind of the height of her touring career, a little bit into the 1900s. But so she had to play the part, right? So what we have here is kind of a mixture, a mishmash, if you will, of various indigenous accoutrements, right? The bear claw necklace, the wampum belt, which I'll talk about a little bit, hanging off her belt. Her little beaded purse looks to be of an Anishinaabe beadwork, the fringe, the kind of things that a non-native audience would expect of a native woman at that time. Didn't have a basis in reality, just a whole bunch of things thrown together. But it spoke the part, right? That's what people expected of her. along with the nose and the profile. And think about these times too. Touring, there was no PA, no speakers, no microphones. It was just her on a solo on a stage, projecting as best she could for those times. She spoke Massey Hall in Toronto. For instance, a big stage back in those days was recently constructed, still in operation today, which is fantastic. But places like that, and much more smaller rooms as well. Next slide, please. And of course, she was also noted for the second part of her presentation. So she would come on. I'm not exactly sure how long her performances were. I'm guessing somewhere half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour back in those days. Not entirely sure, but the whole thing was she would read her quote unquote native poems in that regalia before that I just shown. They were poems highly politically charged in many ways. Cry from an Indian Wife, The Cattle Thief, the Corn Husker, those sorts of things that people know that are very native based in their content, and some of the very activists in its tone for back in those days. Again, the 1880s, 1890s, a much different world than we live in today. So after intermission, she would come back out in this very Victorian dress to kind of literally, I guess, and figuratively, metaphorically, let's say, kind of transform herself into the fine Victorian woman of the age and read more of her Canadian poems. Those things that were kind of the song My Paddle Sings, I would imagine, perhaps would be read while wearing this dress. But things that were more Canadian, sort of patriotic Canadian nationalism, environment, things of that nature. If people are familiar with her work at all, what she would probably do at that point. And again, I would say pandering is probably not the right word, but working an audience, right? Kind of giving them the expectation of a Native woman, strong Native woman, reading these, performing these poems. They're poems written for performance in mind. They have a kind of rhythm to them, and saying some pretty powerful things for back in those days. And then kind of afterwards, a sort of, I don't want to call it assimilation, a performance of assimilation, but it might have had that impact in that audience. Might not have been her intent, but for that time, that's probably what was conveyed to an audience, that a Native woman can do those things, but now things are changed where they're progressing in their ability to assimilate and, in fashion, in speech, in content, to kind of get with the program of being Canadian. And again, we have to also think about the realities of her situation, which I'll get into a little bit. But at this point in her career, she was in her 20s, early 30s, needed to perform to make a living. She was supporting her mother and her sister, and herself, of course. And, one could not bite the hand that feeds or make people feel uncomfortable. So it couldn't have been a performance full of political commentary, calling attention to social injustices of the day, that kind of thing. She'd have to sort of play it down the middle. So I imagine this was her way of doing that, accomplishing that. Selling tickets, probably kind of the priority a little bit. Next slide, please. Here's one that you probably, most people, if you're on this call, you're probably somewhat familiar with Pauline and kind of her whole shtick. This one I like, always the right side. There's the right side again in profile. She's a young woman, a canoeist, right? So she's ready to jump in the Grand River in her canoe and paddle away. But this is kind of a bit of a rarity. This particular pose and photo just sort of shows her engaging the things that she loved, being on the river, being in control of her own vessel, let's say. Song My Paddle Sings arose out of this, but it's a nice little image, just something you don't see all the time with her. A different side of her, let's say, not the performative one, but obviously I think every picture back then is a performative one, maybe. Like I said, it had to be staged right in the studio, but nice carved wooden paddle. Says a lot too, but I just include this for variety's sake. Next slide, please, Christine. So here's her house. This is the house I mentioned earlier, that her father, George Johnson, built in 1856. So if anyone's familiar, I realized I probably should have sent or included a map for those who aren't familiar with the area, but the chiefs would home was built on the north shore of the Grand River along Highway 50, what is now Highway 54, kind of right between Brantford and Caledonia, pretty close to the road. Highway 54, although it's a provincial highway now, is probably quite likely a very ancient footpath that paralleled the river for years and years and years. So it would have been a very highly traveled area, even pre Six Nations arriving in 1784. But anyway, so he had a little bit of wealth at that time. He was a chief and an interpreter for the Six Nations Hereditary Council, which was the traditional council at Six Nations for the last 1,000 years until 1924, when it was taken over by the RCMP and Indian Affairs in Ottawa. But we'll talk about more about that later. But this is the house that he built. As I said, it was designated a National Historic Site in 1953. There's a marker there erected by the province to celebrate the life of Pauline a little bit. That home has been restored a couple times, most recently in 1988, and again a bit more recently. I sat on the Chiefswood Board of Trustees for years and years to kind of oversee the upkeep and all of that. The home was in great shape. They built things to last back then, so her home reflected that. Like I said, her dad was George Johnson, an affluent Mohawk chief and part of the governing council at the time, and her grandfather, George's dad, John Smoke Johnson, his name was a War of 1812 veteran who knew Joseph Brant. So, and John Smoke Johnson was very much alive and well in Pauline's early lifetime. And so she got a lot, she was very close to him by all accounts. So she got a lot of material from him, stories, language, all of that stuff would have came directly from a very credible source, very respected fellow her grandfather was. So a lot of that grounding that she had in the culture and the history was, like I said, she would have known that stuff. And the other interesting thing, which is what a map would have been helpful, but as I said, he built this home. It's two-sided. Can you quickly go to the next one, Christine, please? This is the backside. This is the south side that faces the Grand River. I'm sorry, that's the best image I could find really quickly last night. I apologize, but you get the idea. It's a mirror of the front. So basically, George's intent there was to have two front entrances to his home. One that faced the reserve, which would have been this side that faced the river, the rest of the reserve, and the other north-facing side, basically the non-Indigenous community. The other significant thing there is that just about a half a mile or a kilometer or two from where the house still sits was the old Six Nations Council House that was governed by the Confederacy Chiefs, of which John Smoke Johnson and George Johnson were a part of. And that old council house was the meeting place where all the political things were taken care of, and all the visiting dignitaries and politicos from non-Indigenous Canada or Upper Canada at that time would have met our traditional chiefs and clan mothers in council. Right up until 1863, when the council house was built in Ashwaubenon, the village of Ashwaubenon, on the south side of the Grand River this time. So kind of making that double entrance a bit outdated, I guess, because there wasn't as much political traffic happening. The symbolic nature of it was lost a little bit at that time. Go to the next slide, please. So there's the council house. As you can, I think you can maybe see, hopefully you can see in the PowerPoint, 1863. Still standing in the village of downtown Ashwaubenon, and was constructed by Six Nations individuals, still standing, still in great shape. We're refurbishing that now. So that's where the council house was. So this is where a lot of political activities, like I said, Pauline was born in 1861, so she was a couple years old when this council house was built. And that was the political center of Six Nations from that time. And think about it, 1863, 4 years before Confederation, 13 years before the first big Indian Act, I suppose, where things started to begin to really drastically change for Indigenous people and folks at Six Nations. And it was a tumultuous time into which she was born. Like I said, her dad was well connected politically and culturally. Her grandfather was still around. So this was a time of great change with the Indian Act on the horizon, Canada asserting its authority now. and Six Nations trying to find its, I guess, voice or positionality in regards to Canada. You know, we had, as Jillian said at the outset, the Turo Wampum established our relationship as Haudenosaunee people with the British Crown in the 1600s in the 17th century. So some 200 plus years before this, we had this long-standing relationship with the Crown, but not Canada. So we had to sort of figure out and let Canada know that we had our sovereign identity. We didn't want to be a part of Canada, didn't need to be a part of Canada, but here we were now within the boundaries of what became Canada. So there's a lot going on. And of course, as most people probably know, that the Indian Act was the instrument by which all Indigenous people were to be made Canadian, to be assimilated, to be civilized. And the various sexist and racist policies that were put in place by the Indian Act spoke to that. And you know, we could go on about that, but time's already running a little bit short. So, but I just want to, like I said, set the context of her time, Pauline's time. The other interesting thing about this particular photo is if you can read the placard there, this was a campaign stop for Sir John A. Macdonald. So this is a very small window of time in which Indigenous people had to vote post-Confederation. There was because I think most people know that under the Indian Act, that Native people, we weren't civilized or intellectual enough to be able to make sound political decisions and weren't able to vote in elections. Again, there's a whole other story. But for a small window of time, a year or two, around 1870 something, somewhere in there. Sorry, my Canadian history is a bit off. We did have that vote, and Six Nations was always seen as one of the flagship communities in Canada at the time because we were so progressive, let's say. And ironically enough, we were progressive because we had this traditional form of government that was adaptable enough to take care of our community's needs. So this was a bit of a campaign stop. The other thing that people notice is you can see some trombones and trumpets and the brass band, a military band at the forefront there. Those were all folks from Six Nations, musicians from Six Nations. We had 3 or 4 marching bands back then, if you can believe that. So there's a lot going on in this particular photo. We don't have time to sort of talk about it all, but again, this would have been something during Pauline's time. And for those familiar with Six Nations, you'll notice too that there's not a lot of trees. There's more trees now than there are in this picture. So there already the deforestation of the reserve was happening. And this was widespread across the province. And the reason this is significant for a couple of things, our environmental landscape was changing. Even in our time, like I said, we came here in 1784, 1785 after the revolution. We'd allied ourselves with the British, as I'd said, fought against the Americans. We know what happened in the revolution. So the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, were no longer welcome in the States. Some stayed, but a lot of us moved, and about 2,000 people moved in 1785 under the terms of the Haldimand Deed. That's how we came to be along the Grand River. So a lot of things had changed, and deforestation, that's a tough word, had taken a lot of the timber in southern Ontario and the reserve as well a little bit. You can see that happening here. And I think I was just at a talk, somebody had said about by 1890 or 1900, the approximate number, like the approximate percentage of timber that had been cut already in this area was about 90%, which is stunning, really. So it was already underway that, this was people were taking resources off of our lands. And the reason I say this is significant because there was a big campaign during this time on reserve to stop white people, non-native people from coming on the reserve, taking our timber. They would do that at night. Sometimes they would have, they would pay off some native residents for them to come in, but people were trying to stop it. So George Johnson, Pauline's dad, was active in trying to stop this bootleg timber industry. And one night, I guess a couple times, he was beaten so badly by these fellows who were coming in from off the reserve to take timber that he never recovered from his injuries and died as a result of them at one point. And she was just young. She was in her early 20s. And this was a big blow to her. And again, this is kind of what put her she was the breadwinner of the family at that point because of that, because of the death of her father, and her grandfather was gone now. So there's some trauma going on in her young life too. And a lot of the poetry in which she wrote. If you look at it closely with that lens, you can sort of see that happening. So there was, she aspired to be a writer. She had suffered this loss. She had seen these big changes in her community. So these things are significant. Next slide, please. So her first big break, so to speak, came in 1886. So this is the Brant Memorial Monument that is in downtown Brantford, still stands. It was unveiled here in 1886. They say it was made from with the cannons from the War of 1812 that were melted down and cast in these images. Brant on top there, of course. It's a really interesting monument. But anyway, at that time, Pauline was already kind of notable for writing poetry and being a Mohawk woman from Six Nations. She was commissioned to write a poem, and something. The poem that she wrote was called "Brant: A Memorial Ode," to be read during the unveiling of this. It was, and for whatever reason, she was not allowed to read her own poem, but it was read by the mayor of Brantford, I believe, a non-native guy. So one could see, okay, is that a gendered thing? Is that a a racialized thing? Who knows? But regardless, she was kind of held silent at that particular event. And be that as it may, or read into that, we don't have to talk about that, or we can later. But I think that's a significant moment that Brantford, the town named for Joseph Brant. And later Burlington too, right? We can talk about that if people want to, his connections to Burlington. But Pauline kind of, made a name for herself by writing that poem, but she wasn't allowed to read it. And I dug a little deeper into my own archive, and this is a, I don't know, well, you can see this on the screen here. Where's my camera? This is a medallion that was handed out or made available to people at this unveiling in 1886. So this is the monument here. You can kind of see that. You can sort of see that's just the image of what we're looking at now. Anyway, bought that off a fella on the reserve a few years ago before he passed. But there's a few of them around. They turn up from time to time on eBay, so there must have been a fair number of them distributed during that day. But anyway, there's some 100 and, but I did the math, 138 years ago. All right, next slide, please. So this, of course, is the Mohawk Institute that was in existence in Brantford, just about a 30 minute walk from the Brant statue I just showed you. Mohawk Institute was Canada's longest running residential school, established by the Canadian Church and the New England Company. I think by now most people have heard of it and seen it. I can't remember the exact date of this photo, but it's an early one. But the one before this had burnt down. Probably the one that was around in Pauline's time had burnt down, and this was its replacement. So still intact, right? Still to tell the story. But again, this sort of the tension too between assimilation, enforced assimilation, what to do with Native people, what were happening with the children. This is the backdrop of what Pauline was doing. And so, as I said in my book and elsewhere, other people said too, was Pauline an instrument of this? Did she kind of condone this by talking about be sort of very patriotic in the Canadian vision? And she said in many points in her work that, I think at one point, I can't remember which poem exactly, but at one point she said that Canada's greatest Native people are Iroquois allies, right? What's more Canadian than her Iroquois allies or something like that? I'm paraphrasing, but there was a lot of sense of that going on. But again, did she really feel that way, or was she trying to play nice in her own form of reconciliation with not a whole lot of truth, but by making nice, by sort of bringing people together, unifying people as opposed to taking political stances in the opposite direction? Lots to be talked about there. But again, I just want to sort of set a stage for some of her work. Next slide, please. So also, this is an interesting photo, and this is Pauline's dad, second from the left. I'm pointing at my screen, but you can't see that. Second from the left, that's George Johnson sitting there. And that's her grandfather who's standing, John Smoke Johnson. So this is another photo taken in 1871. So little Pauline's 10 years old. running around Chiefswood, being exposed to all of this stuff. And what's significant here is that these wampum belts, see all the various wampum belts that these are all chiefs and interpreters from Six Nations. I think that's Joseph Snow on the left, who is an Onondaga um, chief at the time, George Johnson to his right, I guess, or his left, our right. And then John Buck, who was the wampum keeper from Six Nations, John Smoke Johnson, as I said. I forget the other guy in the middle. I'm blanking, and then John Seneca Johnson. So anyway, all chiefs and political, cultural leaders at that time gathered for a photo shoot with their wampum belts. The significant things about these wampum belts are those are our treaties, those are our documents, those are very almost call them sacred items that our people held. The agreements between us and indigenous, or sorry, non-indigenous peoples and governments. Lots of wampum belts, and we don't have time to get into each and every one of them, but all of them are important. And this was posed at a studio also in Brantford. But the thing I want to point out here really quickly is if you can see the belt that her grandfather's holding, that is the Pledge of the Crown wampum belt. That's significant because it was a wampum belt that was actually given by the British to Six Nations and other Indigenous allies here in Hamilton at Dundurn Park. So at the close of what is now Dundurn Park, Dundurn Heights, I guess it was. So at the close of the War of 1812, right, and Indigenous people, largely Six Nations, but there were other Anishinaabe and other warriors who helped the British at that time, fought for the British. Some debate as to who won that war. The Americans say they did, the British say they did, but what a lot of Indigenous people say is that we know who lost, and that was Indigenous people. The reason being that after that time, our usefulness as allies and things weren't as great as they were in those conflicts. We were now kind of if anything, a barrier in the way the British, at least, to take over land, to take over resources, all that kind of stuff. So we were kind of the victims of what happened there. But again, a whole other story. But getting back to that wampum belt, so that wampum belt was given, I believe, in April of 1815. So about this time of year, whatever, 209 years ago, is that what that is now? And basically that belt, it was given to our people in honor and recognition of our service in the War of 1812, but also importantly, it was an agreement or a pledge. That's why it's called the Pledge of the Crown. It's a pledge of the British Crown that they would always protect our rights. We would always be allies. They would protect our rights and our interests and our lands in Upper Canada at that time. And interestingly enough, this is the photo was taken when John Smoke Johnson rises to talk about just these things. That's significant because in 1871, Canada became a country. The Indian Act was kind of in its early stages. These are done very deliberately. Like I said earlier, photos were taken for a purpose back then, not just because you had an ice cream cone or a nice dinner somewhere. So it was done for a purpose, and our people would have seen it as such, to remind others that these wampums have meaning, and this is your agreement to uphold these treaty responsibilities and relationships that we still hold. You need to understand and recognize those as well. So these wampum belts would have been the property of the political leadership of the time. And I can't see them too close, but if you look really closely, there's a couple other belts that may or may not have been wampum belts that Pauline also used in that stage costume I showed earlier on. But the Pledge of the Crown is significant because it was, like I said, given at the War of 1812 with its intended purpose, but also that it has a local history, that it was given to our people at what is now Dundurn Castle, about 20 minutes from where I now sit, McMaster campus. So that's significant. But here's another interesting thing. Go to the next slide, please. Now there's another photo, not so great, but that's a photo of the real belt. Here's a replica. It's called an Irish key. Some say it's a Grecian, or it originates in Greece, but it has a meander pattern or something. But it's something that's been seen before a little bit. But it's an Irish key they talk about. So basically, that's an interlocking thing. Like this thing is this thing between us is held fast. It's important, at least the British said that was back in that time. The other thing is for those, I think a few people in the meeting were at, we had an event here on campus just 2 or 3 weeks ago where we brought this belt out. We actually had the same belt that John Smoke Johnson had in his hand. We had here on McMaster campus about 3 weeks ago. So this thing still exists. It's still very real. And we we talk about that because see, this is, the British Crown made this promise and they continue to break it. Canada has supposedly inherited all these things. They continue to break this agreement of respect and responsibility and friendship between our people and the Crown and now Canada as well. Next slide, please. But here's where things get fun. So here is a photo, sort of a promotional flyer, I guess it would have been used for, from Pauline a bit later in life here. See, she's the kind of aging poetess at this point a little bit. But notice I got a close up of that belt. So basically from what I can gather, and maybe some people know more about this than me, but this seems to me a colorized photo, like an early Photoshop thing. So a black and white photo, because they didn't have color photos then, and colorized for promotional purposes. So that's why it doesn't look real, but it's not, it's been touched up. But that belt she has, I'm 99.99% sure that that is the Pledge of the Crown belt. That she probably, again, how she got it, how she procured it from her grandfather, her dad, I'm not too sure. It probably shouldn't have been in her hands as an individual, but she had it and she sold it. As I said, she did a lot of things, she had to make money. And so to make money, you have to travel. To travel costs money. At this time, as a single woman, she didn't have a benefactor really. She was kind of on her own, no agent. She did it all. She had to sell this. She sold this belt to George Hay. So George Hay was I forget what he did for a living, but he had a lot of money, and he started up the Hay Foundation. He's one of the first museums about American Indians he had established in New York City. So he was wealthy. He was a collector. He was a historian. He collected a lot of things by Indigenous people, and he had somehow come into Pauline's orbit at that time, and she sold this belt to him to pay for her trip to England, one of her trips to England. I forget the exact date, somewhere around the turn of the century. So that belt was lost to us at that point. That belt that she had and sold wasn't hers to sell, but she did it. But the interesting thing is, folks at Six Nations, Rick Hill, Paul Williams, others who were in the Confederacy, tracked that belt down in later years, and it was what's the word? Reappropriated, I guess, brought back to Six Nations in 2015, just in time for the 200th anniversary of the close of the War of 1812 and the commemoration of that belt. So maybe some of you on the call were in attendance that day, but we in April of 2015 we met on the grounds of Dundurn Castle and talked about this belt again. So although Pauline, her slip up there, her lapse of judgment, some say that she had intended to pay it back, to get it back, and she probably did. But again, it was tough times for her to travel and make money, so maybe she just couldn't make that payment back. But whatever happened, we did get it back. So that's the good news there. So and that's how it came to be at McMaster campus 2 weeks ago. Next slide, please. So anyway, I just probably should wrap up. Time flies really quickly when you get talking about Pauline and all sorts of stuff. Here's a more recent shot of the Chiefswood mansion estate. Like I said, it's a tourist destination now, and on the banks of the beautiful Grand River. So it's a very sound structure, very regal looking, and it's nice to see that her legacy and his story. And again, I think what I like about Pauline is that she's also very collective. She's an individual poet, as most poets are, but she told a story. She was a proud Mohawk woman with a long ancestry and knew about our history and proclaimed that as much as she could, as best she could from that stage. during that time, a tumultuous time. And I think the tensions of her life and work, with all the various moving parts happening in the late 19th century, really informed a lot of her, the response that she got, the reaction that she had gotten, and kind of her own ability to maneuver, right? How much does she want to really talk about political things, uncomfortable things? There's a need for that, but there's also a need, like I said, to kind of I don't want to say acquiesce to audiences, but to sell tickets, to not make them feel so uncomfortable that they don't want to come and see her. There's that too. Anyway, I think I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's just a final parting shot. Pauline in her canoe on the banks of the beautiful Grand River. But for today's presentation, I just wanted to sort of set the social and political context of her life and times. Because a lot of her poetry we know about, we've read those images. We kind of know her general story, but I want to provide this time a little bit more about the landscape of when and what she wrote about at that time. So anyway, thanks.